The last thing I remember clearly before everything went dark was the sound of the door swinging shut. Not slamming, that would have been too honest. It just closed, quietly, the way Danielle did everything. And I was alone on that delivery table, my blood pressure crashing, the monitors screaming in a language I didn't understand, and every single person who was supposed to save my life had walked out that door to save someone else. Someone my husband loved more than me. I want to tell you that I saw it coming, that there were signs I ignored, red flags I explained away. And honestly, there were. But when you're 51 years old and you finally found something that feels like a real life, a home, a partner, a reason to stay in one place, you tell yourself that the cold feeling in your chest is just anxiety. You tell yourself that the woman who smiles at you with perfect teeth and calls you sweetheart is just a little formal. You tell yourself a lot of things when you're afraid the alternative is true. Let me start at the beginning, or close enough to it. I've lived in Pelican Cove, Florida my entire adult life. It's one of those Gulf Coast resort towns that tourists think they've discovered every summer. Pastel storefronts, charter fishing boats, a boardwalk that floods every hurricane season and gets rebuilt exactly the same way. I came here at 22 with $40 and a duffel bag, got a job waitressing at a seafood place called The Rudder, and somehow never left. That was nearly 30 years ago. I know every cracked sidewalk, every shortcut between the marina and the hospital, every local who tips well and every tourist who doesn't tip at all. My name is Colleen. I'm 51. I wait tables for a living, and I have never once been ashamed of that. I'm good at it. I read a table in about 45 seconds. Who needs refills before they ask? Who's fighting with their spouse? Who's celebrating something and wants to be noticed? It's a skill. People underestimate it. I have 2 cats. Margot, who is 14 and has the personality of a retired judge, tolerates nothing, forgives even less, and Pip, who is 9 and still acts like every morning is his first morning on Earth. They were already mine when I met Garrett. Margot despised him on sight, which I now understand was an early and accurate character assessment. Pip loved him immediately, which I also now understand was just Pip being Pip. I met Garrett Holloway 7 years ago in February. Sleet was coming down sideways off the Gulf. We get those ugly February days sometimes, the kind the tourism brochures never mention, when the sky turns the color of wet concrete and the snowbirds all go back to their condos and the town belongs to the locals again. He came into the Rudder alone, sat at the counter, ordered the grouper sandwich and a cup of coffee, and left a $20 tip on a $12 check. I noticed. You notice things like that when you've been waiting tables for 25 years. He came back the next week, and the week after that. By March, we were talking for longer than it took him to eat. By April, he'd asked me to dinner, a real dinner, not at the Rudder. He was 53 at the time, recently retired from a career in commercial insurance, divorced once, no kids of his own. He'd moved to Pelican Cove to slow down, he said, to breathe. He was steady. That was the thing about Garrett that got me. I'd had enough of unsteady men in my 20s and 30s, the kind who were exciting right up until they weren't, and then they were just exhausting. Garrett was calm. He paid his bills on time. He called when he said he would call. He remembered things I told him, small things, like that I hated cilantro and loved those little key lime tarts from the bakery on Strand Street. He seemed to actually listen. We got married in late September, 2 years after we met. Small ceremony at the gazebo by the marina, about 20 people. Dinner afterward at the Rudder because the owner, Pam, gave us the back room for free. And honestly, where else would we have done it? I wore a tea-length dress the color of seafoam, and Pip knocked the flower arrangement off the kitchen counter that morning and ate part of it. So we started the day with an emergency call to the vet, who told us baby's breath is only mildly toxic, and to just watch him. Classic Pip. Garrett had 1 son from his first marriage, Devin. Devin was 31 when Garrett and I got married, living up in Sarasota, working in commercial real estate. Devin was fine. Quiet, a little distant, but not unfriendly. We saw him maybe 4 times a year, Thanksgiving, Christmas, occasional weekends. I never tried to be his mother. I was smart enough to know that wasn't what was needed. We were more like friendly acquaintances who shared a last name by marriage. It worked. Then Devin met Danielle. I remember the first time Garrett mentioned her. We'd been married about a year and a half. He came home from a weekend visit with Devin looking a little thoughtful, poured himself a bourbon and said, "Dev's been seeing someone. Seems pretty serious." "That's great," I said, and I meant it. Devin was a grown man who deserved to be happy. "She's very," Garrett paused, rolling the glass between his palms, "polished." I didn't ask what he meant. I thought he just meant she was put together, professional. I filled in the word with something benign and moved on. I met Danielle 3 weeks later when Devin brought her down to Pelican Cove for a Saturday visit. She was 34, originally from Charlotte, worked in pharmaceutical sales. She was beautiful in that very deliberate way, the kind of beautiful that requires significant daily maintenance and wants you to know it. Not a hair out of place, cream-colored silk blouse, nails done in a French manicure so perfect it almost looked fake. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, "Colleen, I've heard so much about you. It is so lovely to finally meet you." Her voice was warm. Her eyes were measuring. I smiled back and said it was wonderful to meet her too. Margot walked into the room, looked at Danielle, turned around, and left. I thought about that for a while afterward. We had lunch on the patio. Danielle was perfectly pleasant. She asked about my work at the Rudder with what sounded like genuine interest. That must be so rewarding, connecting with people every day. And I noticed the slight pause before rewarding, the tiny recalibration she made when she'd clearly been about to say something else. She complimented our house. She said the view of the water was so charming. She helped clear the plates without being asked. When she and Devin left, Garrett said, "See? She's lovely." "She's very polished," I said, using his word back at him. He laughed. "You'll warm up to her." That was the thing about Danielle. There was never anything you could point to. No rudeness, no cruelty, no obvious slight. Just this persistent, low-level feeling that I was being assessed, that everything I said and did was being filed away somewhere, noted in some internal ledger I would never be allowed to see. When I mentioned it to my friend Roxanne, who also waitresses at the Rudder and has known me for 15 years, she said, "Girl, you're overthinking it. Some people are just formal." Maybe. I tried to believe that. Devin and Danielle got engaged 11 months after they started dating. They announced it at Christmas dinner at our house, my kitchen, the table I'd set with the good plates, and everyone was delighted, and I clapped and hugged Devin and said all the right things. Danielle showed me the ring and said, "I hope this means we'll be much closer from now on." She squeezed my hand when she said it. I went to the kitchen to check on the roast and stood at the counter for a moment, looking out at the dark water, telling myself the feeling in my stomach was heartburn. They set the wedding for the following September, and Danielle immediately, efficiently, began reshaping everything around it. Which venue, which caterer, which florist, which family members would sit where. She had a spreadsheet. She had a timeline. She had opinions about everything, delivered in that pleasant, reasonable voice that made it impossible to object without sounding difficult. About 2 months into the engagement planning, she started making small suggestions about how Garrett might want to be more involved in certain things. Could Garrett handle the rehearsal dinner logistics? Could Garrett talk to his cousin Ray about keeping the toast brief? Could Garrett perhaps speak to the venue about the deposit timeline? None of it was unreasonable. Each individual request made sense. But I noticed over the weeks that the requests always involved Garrett's time, Garrett's attention, Garrett's presence, and they were always framed as coming from love. "I just want Devin's father to really feel part of this," in a way that made it sound almost selfless. I noticed. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? And then, in early February again, sleet again, the Gulf gone gray and flat, Danielle called the house while I was at work. Garrett mentioned it casually over dinner. She'd called to discuss something about the wedding venue contract. They'd talked for almost an hour. About the contract? I asked. Well, that and other things. She wanted my perspective on some family stuff. He looked up from his plate. She's thoughtful, Colleen. She really is. She thinks about things. I looked at my husband's face. He was smiling slightly, in the way people smile when they've been made to feel useful and appreciated. And I thought, there it is. That's what Danielle does. She doesn't push people away. She pulls them in, one careful conversation at a time, until they're oriented around her, without quite knowing when it happened. I took a sip of my water and said, "That's nice, honey." But Margot had jumped up onto the table and was staring at me from across the breadbasket, and I swear to God that cat looked like she was trying to tell me something. I just wasn't ready to hear it yet. The wedding was beautiful. I say that without irony because it was. Danielle had seen to that with the same ruthless precision she applied to everything else. September in Sarasota, outdoor ceremony at a venue with a Spanish tile roof and bougainvillea climbing every wall. 200 guests in chairs the color of warm sand. I wore a dusty rose mother-of-the-groom adjacent dress that Danielle had gently steered me toward during a shopping trip she'd organized, and which I genuinely liked, which made me trust my own instincts a little less. Garrett cried during the vows. I reached over and squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and in that moment I thought, this is enough. Watching the man you love cry happy tears for his son. This is what family looks like. I held on to that moment for a long time afterward, because the months that followed took it apart piece by piece. It started slowly. Most things that hollow you out do. Danielle and Devin bought a house in Sarasota, a real house, not a condo, 4 bedrooms, backyard pool, the whole thing. And suddenly there was always a reason for Garrett to drive up there. The bathroom tile needed a second opinion. The air conditioning unit was making a noise and Devin was traveling for work. Could Garrett come look at the pool pump? Garrett was handy. Garrett was helpful. Garrett went. At first it was once a month, then twice. By the following spring it was most weekends, and sometimes he'd stay over Sunday night and drive back Monday morning, which meant I was eating dinner alone on Sundays and waking up to an empty house on Mondays, and telling myself it was fine because he was helping his son settle into a new home, and that was what good fathers did. I told myself that. I told Roxanne that. I told my other friend Willa, who bartends at a place called The Lighthouse 3 blocks from the Rudder and has the best radar for nonsense of anyone I've ever met. Willa looked at me over her glass of Pinot and said, "Colleen, he's up there every weekend?" "Most weekends." "And you're not going with him?" "Danielle likes to have her projects." I shrugged. "I'm not really a project person." Willa didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Have you actually talked to him about this?" I had. Or I'd tried to. I'd said one evening in early April that I felt like I was losing my weekends with him, and Garrett had looked genuinely confused. Genuinely, not performatively, and said, "You could always come up with me, Colleen. The door's open." "Is it?" I asked. "Has Danielle said that?" A pause. "She'd be happy to have you." Which was not the same thing as yes. We both knew it, and we both let it slide, which was its own kind of answer. By summer, something had shifted in Garrett that I couldn't quite name. He was still kind, still present in the ways that mattered on the surface. He still remembered that I hated cilantro, still brought home the key lime tarts sometimes. But there was a new distance in him, a new preoccupation. He'd be sitting across from me at dinner and I'd look up and see him somewhere else entirely, his eyes on his phone. And I'd ask what he was looking at and he'd say, "Nothing, just Devin." Or, "Danielle had a question about something." And I'd nod and eat my fish, and Margot would sit in the corner judging both of us. In August, Danielle announced she was pregnant. The announcement came via a group text that included Garrett and me and about 30 other people, her parents, his parents, assorted cousins and college friends, a little pink and blue graphic with the words, "Baby Holloway coming March." I found out the same way a stranger would find out, through my phone. At work, during the lunch rush, standing next to the drink station with a tray of iced teas. I texted back a string of happy emojis because that's what you do. I finished my shift. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside. Garrett was already home, on the phone, laughing. Actually laughing. This easy, unguarded laugh I hadn't heard from him in months. When he saw me, he held up one finger and kept talking. "No, I know, it's incredible, yeah, I'll be there, absolutely." He was glowing. Not in a guilty way. In a completely uncomplicated, transparent, genuine way that somehow made it worse. He got off the phone and said, "Can you believe it? A grandkid, Colleen." "I know," I said. "I saw the text." Something crossed his face, just a flicker. "She wanted to tell you in person, but Devin was excited and—" "It's fine," I said. "Really, congratulations, Garrett. This is wonderful news." And I meant it, mostly. I meant the part about it being wonderful for them. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say without sounding like a monster, was that I also felt, in some complicated way I didn't fully understand yet, like I was watching the last door close. The pregnancy gave Danielle's gravitational pull a new intensity. Now there were doctor's appointments Garrett drove up for, baby furniture decisions that needed his input, apparently, nursery paint colors, car seat research. Garrett became fully absorbed into the project of Danielle's pregnancy, in a way that I can only describe as total, like everything else, including me, had moved into some other frequency that he could no longer quite tune into. I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice, how he'd answer her calls in the middle of conversations with me and not come back for 20 minutes, how he'd repeat things she'd said as though they were self-evidently true, the way people do when they've fully adopted someone else's worldview. How, when I mentioned feeling disconnected, carefully, gently choosing my words, he'd say something like, "You know how important this is to her, Colleen. She doesn't have family close by. We're all she's got." We, not me and Devin, we. He'd redrawn the boundary of the family without telling me, and I was on the outside of it looking in. I want to be honest about this part. I was also pregnant. Not planned. 51 years old, I'd been through menopause early, 48, and had not even considered the possibility. But bodies are strange, and mine apparently had one last surprise in it, because in late October I took a test on a Tuesday morning in our bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub for a long time, staring at two lines that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my life. I was terrified. I was also, underneath the terror, something I can only call quietly amazed, the way you feel when something completely impossible turns out to be true. I told Garrett that same night. I sat him down at the kitchen table and I told him, and I watched his face go through about 6 different expressions in about 4 seconds. Surprise, confusion, and then something that looked briefly like alarm. "Are you?" he started. "Are you sure?" "2 tests," I said, "both positive." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Colleen, we need to think about this carefully." "I know," I said. "I know it's complicated. I know there are risks at my age. I know it's a lot." "It's not just the risks," he said. He was looking at the table. "The timing. Danielle's due in March and—" I stared at him. "What does Danielle's due date have to do with this?" He looked up. "Nothing, I just meant, there's a lot happening, that's all." But that wasn't all. I knew it wasn't all. He was thinking about her even then, even sitting across from his own wife, who had just told him she was carrying his child. He was thinking about her schedule, her timeline, how this news would land in that other orbit he'd moved himself into. I had a high-risk pregnancy from the start. My OB, Dr. Patricia Osei, was direct with me from the first appointment. Perimenopause pregnancy carried real risks. I'd need monitoring. I'd need to take it seriously. She was not alarmed, but she was not breezy about it either, and I appreciated that. I liked Patricia. She was matter-of-fact in a way that made me feel steadied rather than scared. Garrett came to the first 2 appointments. He held my hand. He asked the right questions. And then Danielle's pregnancy had a small scare, something with her blood pressure, nothing ultimately serious, as I learned later, and he drove up to Sarasota on a Thursday and didn't come back until Sunday, and the 3rd appointment I went to alone. I sat in the waiting room with my coat on my lap and my hands folded, and I looked at the other women there, most of them a good 20 years younger than me, some of them with partners beside them, some alone, and I thought about all the times in my life I'd done hard things by myself. The $40 and the duffel bag, the years of early morning shifts. I knew how to be alone. I'd been alone for most of my adult life. I was good at it, but I thought those days were behind me. That was the part that hurt. It was Roxanne who broke through the shell I'd built around it. She showed up at my house one evening in early December with a pot of chicken soup, and the specific expression she gets when she's decided not to take no for an answer. Jaw set, eyes direct, absolutely no softness in the posture. She set the soup on the counter, turned around and said, "Tell me what's actually happening." So I did. All of it. The weekends, the phone calls, the third appointment alone, the way Garrett had looked at the kitchen table when I'd told him I was pregnant, the thing he'd said about Danielle's due date. Roxanne listened without interrupting, which is not her natural inclination but which she managed. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Colleen," she said, "I love you, and I have to say something hard." "Okay." "He has emotionally left this marriage. I don't know if he knows it yet, but he has." I didn't cry. I'd already cried alone, in the car, in the shower, in the cereal aisle at the grocery store at 6 in the morning when no one was there to see it. I'd used up a lot of the acute grief already. What I felt in that moment was something colder and cleaner, something that felt, strangely, like clarity. "What do I do?" I asked. Roxanne sat down across from me. "First thing, and I mean first, before anything else, you call your doctor Monday morning and you make sure everything with this pregnancy is being watched. Everything. You do not let that slip. And second?" She looked at me steadily. "You start paying attention, not emotionally, strategically. You start noticing what's being decided without you, what's being moved, what's being rearranged." She paused. "And you get yourself a lawyer. Not because you're definitely getting divorced, but because you need to know what you're standing on." I thought about Garrett's face at the kitchen table. I thought about the way he'd said, "We're all she's got," and not heard himself say it. I thought about the quiet click of a door closing, not slamming, never slamming. That would have been too honest. "Yeah," I said. "Okay." That night, after Roxanne left, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and looked up family law attorneys in Sarasota County. Not Pelican Cove, somewhere no one would recognize my name. I wrote down 3 numbers. Margot jumped up and sat on the keyboard, and I let her stay there for a minute, her warm weight against my wrists, while I thought about what I was about to do. Then I moved her gently aside, pulled the laptop back, and started making a list. Not of grievances. Not of things Garrett had done wrong, a list of facts, dates, amounts, decisions, absences, the kind of list that means something in a room with a lawyer, the kind of list that turns a feeling into a document. I was 51 years old, pregnant, and the man I'd married had started living in someone else's orbit without telling me. I was scared, and I was tired, and I was still, in some quiet corner of myself, in love with him, which made the whole thing worse. But I had been alone before. I knew what it cost, and I knew I could pay it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I hadn't let myself fully looked at yet, something was beginning to form. Not a plan exactly, more like a reckoning. The baby came on a Thursday in late March. Not Danielle's baby, mine. My water broke at 4:17 in the morning while I was standing in the kitchen getting a glass of water, and I stood there for a full 30 seconds with my hand on the counter, water pooling on the tile floor, thinking with perfect, absurd clarity, I should have put down a rug there. I'd been meaning to put down a rug. I called Garrett. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Colleen?" "My water broke," I said. "I need you to take me to the hospital." A pause. Okay, yeah, give me a minute." He was dressed in 4 minutes. He drove fast and didn't say much, and I sat in the passenger seat breathing through contractions that were already closer together than they were supposed to be for a first-time labor, which technically this wasn't. I'd had a miscarriage at 37, early, before the relationship that caused it fell apart, but my body was treating it like it was. Patricia had warned me. "High risk," she'd said. Not alarming, but not to be taken lightly. We got to Sarasota Memorial at 5:04. Garrett parked and came around to help me out of the car, and for those 45 seconds of walking through the parking garage, I thought, this is still us. Whatever else is broken, this is still us. He had his arm around me and his hand was warm and solid on my back, and I let myself believe, just for those 45 seconds, that everything was going to be fine. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Something changed in his face. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of alertness, a sharpening. "It's Devin," he said. "Garrett," I said. "I am in active labor." "I know. I'll just... 1 second." He answered it. I kept walking. A nurse met me at the entrance with a wheelchair, and I sat down and let her wheel me in, and I did not look back to see if Garrett was following. He was, eventually. He came into the triage room and stood by the window while the nurses got me set up, and he was present in the physical sense, body in the room, eyes on me, but his phone was in his hand and it buzzed twice while Dr. Osei's resident was checking my dilation, and I watched him look at the screen both times. "What's happening with Devin?" I asked when the resident stepped out. "Danielle's in labor too," he said. I looked at him. "She's not due for another 2 weeks." "I know, but apparently it started an hour ago and—" He stopped. He knew what he was about to say. I could see him knowing it. "And what?" I asked. "She's at Sarasota General. That's 12 minutes from here." The room was quiet. The monitor was making its steady, rhythmic sound. My body was doing the thing bodies do, whether you're paying attention or not. "Garrett," I said very carefully, "you are not leaving this hospital." "I'm not leaving," he said. Devin's alone with her. Her family's in Charlotte." "I'm alone with me," I said. "My family is also not here. I am your wife." He looked at me and I saw it then, clearly, the thing I'd been half seeing for over a year. Not malice, not even cruelty. Something worse. A man who had already made his choice and didn't fully know it yet, standing in a hospital room with the woman he'd married, and calculating. I turned away from him and looked at the ceiling. "Do what you're going to do," I said. He stayed for 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. A nurse named Bernarda, solid, efficient, warm in the way that costs nothing but means everything, came in to check my blood pressure and noted that it was elevated, and said she'd be back in 20 minutes. Garrett stood at the window and looked at his phone, and stood at my side and held my hand, and stood at the window again. His presence in that room was the most exhausting thing I'd ever experienced. Then Devin called again. Garrett stepped into the hallway to take it. He was gone for 7 minutes. When he came back in, he didn't sit down. "Colleen," he said. "Don't," I said. "She's having complications. They're saying it might be an emergency C-section, and Devin he's falling apart. He doesn't know what to do, and I'm 12 minutes away." I looked at him. My blood pressure was still elevated. Bernarda was going to come back in 13 minutes and see it and flag it to Dr. Osei's team. I knew that. I also knew that I was 51 years old, and that Patricia had said not to be taken lightly, and that the monitoring I was hooked up to was there for a reason. "If you walk out that door," I said, "I need you to understand what you're doing. You have doctors here, you have nurses, you're being monitored. Garrett, she might lose the baby, Colleen. Devin is—" "Get out," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was surprised by that. "Go, I mean it, go." He went. What happened in the next 2 hours I have reconstructed partly from memory, and partly from the medical records I requested later, and partly from what Bernarda told me afterward, because there were about 40 minutes in there where my memory gets unreliable. My blood pressure spiked. Dr. Osei was called in. There was a period, and this is the part that still makes my hands go cold when I think about it, when it was genuinely unclear whether the situation was going to resolve on its own or escalate into something that could not be undone. Bernarda stayed in that room with me almost the entire time. She held my hand during the worst of it. She talked to me in a low, steady voice about completely ordinary things, her daughter's science fair project, a recipe she'd been trying to get right, and I focused on her voice the way you focus on a fixed point when you're trying not to fall. My son was born at 9:47 in the morning, 5 pounds 14 ounces. He was early, 36 weeks, and he needed a little help breathing at first, which produced the most terrifying 90 seconds of my life. And then he cried, and I cried, and Bernarda, who I had known for less than 5 hours, cried a little too. His name is Miles. I decided on it weeks before, alone, which turned out to be appropriate. Garrett arrived at the hospital at 11:23. I know the exact time because Roxanne had arrived at 9, after I'd managed to call her between contractions, and she was sitting in the chair beside my bed when Garrett walked in, and I saw her clock him with the expression of someone who has been waiting to see exactly this. He looked at Miles in the bassinet, and something moved through his face that I recognized as genuine, the particular undoing that happens to people when they see a newborn, especially one that belongs to them. He said, "Colleen, I'm so sorry." "How is Danielle?" I asked. He looked startled that I'd asked. She's okay. The baby's okay. It was a C-section, but they're both fine." "Good," I said, and I meant that too. Whatever I felt about Danielle, I did not want a child to die. "Sit down, Garrett." He sat. Roxanne did not leave. She picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window with the focused attention of someone who is absolutely listening to every word. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to hear it the first time, because I'm not going to repeat it." He nodded. "You left me in active labor to go to her," I said, "not to your son, to her. I want you to sit with that and not explain it to me." He started to say something. I said, "Don't explain it," I said. "There is no version of what you just did that holds up. I know you love Devin, I know you'd do anything for him, but you looked at me on that table and you chose, and we both know who you were thinking about when you made that choice." The silence in the room was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. "I spoke to a lawyer in December," I said. "Her name is Judith Crane. I've been documenting dates, absences, financial decisions made without my involvement. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because I'm done managing your guilt about it. That's yours now. You carry it." Garrett looked at the bassinet where Miles was sleeping with his tiny fists curled against his chest. "I don't want to lose you," he said, and his voice broke on the last word, and some part of me, the part that had loved him for 7 years, the part that still loved him even then, wanted to reach for him. I didn't. "You didn't lose me," I said. "You left me. Those are different things." He filed for divorce 6 weeks later, which I had half expected and which still landed like a stone dropped from a height. Judith was thorough and unsentimental and excellent. The settlement took 4 months, and it was not painless, nothing real ever is. But when it was done, I had the house, a fair split of Garrett's retirement accounts, and child support for Miles that was calculated correctly and documented properly so that no one could fudge the numbers later. Garrett's lawyer tried twice to reduce the support figure, and Judith shut it down both times with the brisk efficiency of someone swatting flies. Garrett moved to Sarasota. Of course he did. I don't know the exact nature of what exists between him and Danielle, whether it was always something physical or whether it was something else. The particular intimacy of being needed by someone beautiful who organizes her need into perfectly reasonable requests. I stopped trying to understand it. What I know is that he is present in Miles's life. He comes down to Pelican Cove twice a month. He holds his son and reads to him, and there is something genuine in that, something I do not want to poison. So I hand Miles over, and I go to the rudder, or I sit on the porch with Margot, and I let it be what it is. Miles is 14 months old now. He has Garrett's calm eyes and my stubbornness, and no patience whatsoever for anyone who isn't paying attention to him, which is the most accurate thing I've ever seen. He and Pip have developed a mutual fascination that mostly involves Miles trying to grab Pip's tail, and Pip allowing it with the long-suffering tolerance of a cat who has decided this is simply his life now. Margot supervises from the couch, with the expression of a retired judge who has seen everything and is no longer surprised by any of it. Bernarda came to my house for dinner 3 months after Miles was born. I invited her because I didn't know how else to say thank you for a thing that doesn't have a word for it. for staying in a room with a frightened woman and talking about a science fair project until the crisis passed. She brought a casserole and held Miles for an hour and told me her daughter won second place, which she considered a robbery. I agreed. Roxanne still shows up with soup when she decides I need it, which is more often than I need soup, and exactly as often as I need her. Willa pours me a glass of Pinot sometimes after my shift, and we sit at the end of the bar and talk about nothing important, and that is its own kind of medicine. I still wait tables at the Rudder. I'm 52 now and I'm good at it, and I am not ashamed of that. I never was. I read a table in 45 seconds. I know who needs refills before they ask, who's celebrating, who's hurting. It's a skill. People underestimate it. What I didn't know 7 years ago, sitting at a counter in February with sleet coming off the Gulf, was that the man who left a $20 tip on a $12 check was not the man I thought he was. Not a villain. Just someone who had more capacity for kindness toward the person in front of him than loyalty to the person he'd promised. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them cost me more than I want to count. But I have Miles. I have Margot, who at 15 years old has achieved a level of dignified contempt that I find genuinely aspirational. I have Pip, who still acts like every morning is his first morning on Earth, which at 10 years old is either a miracle or a medical mystery, and I prefer not to investigate it too closely. I have this town.